Have you ever fallen for someone who just seemed to perpetually push you away, no matter how much love and reassurance you offered them? If so, chances are you encountered the insidious, self-destructive force known as the poor me mentality. At its core, the poor me perspective stems from a deep, all-consuming belief of being fundamentally unlovable and unworthy of care. This negative self-concept and distorted self-image often finds its origins in painful childhood wounds, neglect, abuse, inconsistent or unavailable parenting. These early experiences wire the developing brain to associate intimacy with rejection and abandonment. The poor me psyche is rooted in unresolved attachment trauma, which I've explored across many of my videos that you can check out here on my channel. The long-term impacts of not having your core attachment needs met as a child leave lasting psychic scars that breed insecurity and self-loathing. So while the poor me's hostile, self-sabotaging behaviors may seem baffling or even enraging in adulthood, they represent deeply entrenched psychological coping mechanisms, maladaptive mind prisons formed from years of being conditioned that human connection only leads to hurt. The poor me individual develops a phobic attitude towards intimacy and vulnerability, while still craving it deeply. Getting too close, too loved, activates their core fear of inevitable abandonment, so they engage in preemptive self-protection through chronic sabotaging behaviors. This can manifest through overt acts of hostility, nitpicking, lashing out, punishing the giver of affection, or more covert means like stonewalling, withdrawing, provoking arguments, gaslighting, cheating, and so on, all roads leading to the same tragic destination, confirming the poor me prophecy by driving their loved one away. Paradoxically, for the poor me psyche, there is a sick comfort, even satisfaction in being rejected yet again. You see, I warned you I was unlovable. My suffering is inescapable. Victimhood becomes an intoxicating identity to cling to, however toxic. Meanwhile, for the loved one on the receiving end, it is utterly bewildering and emotionally depleting. They pour out their heart, make every effort only to be constantly devalued, doubted, rebuffed. Over time, it can obliterate self-esteem and leave one feeling hopeless, resentful, and utterly spent. This repeated rejection and withdrawal frequently leads to an on-again, off-again relationship pattern. The perpetual cycle goes like this. First, there is the pursuit phase where the poor me individual is affectionate, vulnerable, and seemingly wants true intimacy and commitment. It's that immediate availability for commitment that hooks the other person instantly and is also the biggest red flag to consider. In the first weeks, poor me is ready to move in, get married and have kids, metaphorically or literally. Then also in the first weeks comes the devaluation phase as the poor me starts pushing away through criticism, negativity, creating distance. The distance between their desire for the perfect enabling partner and the real person in front of them becomes too wide to sustain, so they become easily disenchanted by the reality of the other person who was simply trying to erect reasonable boundaries around appropriate relationship escalation and timeline. But sensing that addictive, intermittent reinforcement cycle of pursuit and devaluation, that emotional roller coaster hits the poor me's neurons like a drug. This vicious cycle of hot and cold leaves their partner walking on eggshells, frantically trying to fix things. Boundaries are met with sheer aggression and an attitude of, "You don't love me in the same way that I do." What they avoid to look into is a pattern where poor me has zero interest in another person, has no clue about building healthy connections, so they jump into the very first signs of a possible connection with an idealized image of what a relationship and a partner should look like, feel like, behave like, etc. They never took a moment to create the right premises for a new relationship, to actually truly know that other person, to provide the needed respect for such an important endeavor to unfold. They just saw something they seemed to like, decided for themselves that that was going to be it, and then started to pull their hair out when the actual living person in front of them didn't resemble at all the picture in poor me's head. So when the devaluation inevitably reaches an apex and the relationship ruptures, we enter the discard phase. The partner feels utterly dejected and discarded like garbage after all their efforts. However, once the poor me has created sufficient distance and confirmed their belief of being unlovable, the idealization phase begins again. They start love bombing with proclamations of love and regret, resuscitating the hope that this time will be different. And so the cycle of cruelty repeats, each round further eroding the self-worth and emotional reserves of the partner trapped in this tidal wave of push and pull. Many become addicted to this cycle of intermittent reinforcement, chasing the highs of feeling desired again. And this is where poor me meets narcissism. I'll get into that in another video. Unless one has the iron willpower to break free from these mind games, on-off relationships with a poor me partner inevitably lead to long-term emotional and psychological scarring. The only path to peace is distancing from these toxic dynamics for good. The poor me has mastered a self-fulfilling cycle of emotional starvation, craving intimacy yet sabotaging every attempt to be loved and accepted. Theirs is a thirst that can never be quenched because they hold the cup at arm's length. In addition to the pursuit-devaluation cycle, another nefarious hallmark of the poor me psyche is widespread gaslighting of their romantic partners. Gaslighting, for those unfamiliar, is a malicious form of psychological abuse and manipulation where the abuser bends truth and objective realities to favor their own distorted narratives. The victim's memories, perceptions, and experiences are gradually eroded and called into question until they become profoundly distrusting of themselves and ready to become a marionette in the poor me's world, a mindless provider of poor me fuel. For the poor me, gaslighting frequently happens in the here and now, moments of conflict or call-outs from their partner. Because they have virtually zero skills or framework for sustaining healthy relating, the poor me inevitably mistreats their loved one through chronic dismissiveness, disrespect, broken promises, or emotional outbursts and constant drama. And when their partner musters the courage to call them out on this hurtful behavior as it's actively happening, the gaslighting skyrockets to astonishing, bewildering levels. The poor me will flatly deny events that just transpired right before their partner's eyes mere seconds ago. "I never said that," they'll lie with conviction, despite absolutely uttering those very words. Their partner's reality becomes rendered invisible, as the poor me insists whatever cruel, derogatory, or uncaring actions they took never actually manifested, at least not how the partner perceived them. The gaslighting persists with doubling down. "You're twisting things again and making me out to be the bad guy like you always do." So suddenly, the victim pointing out mistreatment becomes reframed as the abuser and instigator simply for calling a spade about the poor me's freshly committed trespass against them. The perpetrator masquerades as the true victim yet again. By the end of these mind-bending episodes, the poor me has spun things so convincingly that their partner is left questioning their own experiences and self-worth. Was I really just drastically misremembering what they said to me? Maybe I'm being hypersensitive and calling innocuous things emotional abuse. This shatters trust and leaves the loved one reeling in cognitive dissonance. Sanity and objective truth feel maddeningly untethered as the poor me repeatedly denies apparent realities with authoritative incredulity. The partner yearns to feel grounded and understood again, but realizes there's no solid foundation possible with someone dedicated to such flagrant truth revisions. Even the most innocuous call-out can instantly curdle into a Kafkaesque gaslighting vortex in the poor me's world of distorted reality pretzels. It's one of the arenas where the poor me's skills at mindfuckery reach artistic levels. But the soaring highs of their gaslighting techniques represent a tragic new bottom for the loved one just seeking basic reciprocity, leaving them to wonder if they can ever rebuild a functional compass of mutual truth and trust in the wake of such meticulously choreographed destabilization. But gaslighting is one of the most appreciated drugs that feed poor me, as it allows them to reinforce their martyr identity and defend against any accountability for their toxic behavior. Their inflamed insecurities and perpetual distrust warp virtually all situations into the "I'm being persecuted" lenses they crave. So when called out over hurtful actions or contradictions in their self-portrayal, the poor me gaslighter vehemently denies, outright lies, or blames their partner as being the actual source of trauma and mistreatment. "I never said that. You're making things up again. You're the one who disrespected me first," become commonplace retorts. Since we're here, the "you did it first" defense is another classic and immensely toxic move from the poor me's gaslighting playbook. Let me expand on how this childish reversal enables them to evade all accountability. When backed into a corner over explicit misdeeds or cruel behaviors, the poor me panics and regresses into the psychological defenses of a petulant toddler. Unable to take ownership, they instinctively revert to projecting blame through that classic childhood refrain, "But you did it to me first." Like a masterclass in lack of self-awareness, the poor me remains committed to never being the original transgressor, no matter how indisputably obvious their hurtful actions were. There must always be some way to retroactively claim their partner started it in order to justify subsequent retaliation. "You're the one who disrespected me first by working late," they might accusingly retort when called out over explosive rages or the silent treatment upon their partner's return, as if basic work obligations are now sold as the root justification for abuse. Or they might reach deep into the memory hole, dredging up weeks, months, years old perceived slights as their expressed rationale for contemporary domestic violations. "Yeah, well, you hurt me way worse that time, you this or that," becomes the game of narcissistic pinball to avoid any culpability. The more seemingly minor the original allegation of hurt from their partner, the more vindicated the poor me feels in their inevitable overreactions and transgressions of boundaries. It's a psychological forte, being able to amplify the most invisible of offenses into a full-blown pretzel logic justifying their worst behavior. At its core, this reversal is utterly dehumanizing for their loved one. It robs them of having any legitimate emotional experience by preemptively invalidating their grievances as always being derivative responses, never the actual source. Like being cookie stamped over by a truck, then blamed for provoking and damaging its tire tread. The partner's role is rendered as the perpetual instigator through these infant-brained loopings. Someone to be conveniently psychologically crushed under at all times, only for the poor me to then cry bully and make victim theater over the rubble they themselves created. It's an extraordinarily cruel responsibility-avoidant tactic. But for the fragile poor me psyche, being able to one-up any call-out for toxic patterns with "yeah, but you did it first," or worst or more, is preferable to the terrifying work of self-examination. Even if the mental gymnastics of blame reversal become more dizzying and unhinged by the day. They may selectively remember only pieces of interactions that paint them as the victim, or claim hurtful statements and actions were just jokes the overly sensitive partner failed to understand. Inconvenient evidence like texts, emails, or third-party witnesses are all hand-waved away as falsified or biased against the poor me. This causes their partner's reality to become bafflingly untethered over time. Their recollections of affection, promises made, even outright mistreatment gets erased and refuted with such aggressive conviction that they begin questioning their own sanity and perception. Once this disorienting disconnection from objective reality takes hold, the poor me can more readily demand compliance, absolution of their worst behaviors, and prevent future abandonment by keeping their partner unsteadied and deeply afraid of leaving the insecure enmeshment. It's one of the poor me's most destructive weapons for maintaining dysfunctional relationship dynamics at all costs. Because if they can convince their loved one that truth and sanity itself are malleable concepts, how can the abused ever feel justified escaping the cycle built on weaponized delusions? In our next installment, we'll take a deeper look at more specific toxic dynamics and push-pull cycles the poor me perpetuates in their relationships as they compulsively replay these childhood wounds. From chronic sabotaging acts to baseless jealousy, to always feeling disrespected, we'll explore the paradoxical ways the poor me both craves and recoils from intimacy. So be sure to tune in next time as we take a harder look at these tragic, self-fulfilling patterns while cultivating some compassion for the human core fears and attachment needs driving the poor me's dysfunctional relating styles.